In the early years of what would become the United States, the foundations of society were not formed in a vacuum. They emerged from a world shaped by exploration, settlement, and conflict. As European settlers arrived on the shores of North America, they brought with them ideas about land, power, and identity, ideas deeply rooted in the belief that some groups were entitled to rule while others were expected to submit. This belief would influence the creation of laws, customs, and institutions that guided daily life in the colonies and the early republic. At the time, the land was already home to thriving indigenous nations with their own systems of governance, culture, and spiritual connection to the land. These communities were recognized among themselves as sovereign peoples. However, European settlers viewed the territory through a different lens, one that saw the land as something to be claimed and controlled. Legal frameworks soon emerged that recognized the rights of settlers while denying or minimizing the rights of the indigenous people who had lived there for generations. Through treaties, forced agreements, and shifting boundaries, the presence of indigenous communities was gradually restricted. Similarly, as the transatlantic slave trade expanded, people of African descent were brought to the colonies under conditions of forced labor. Over time, colonial governments put laws into place that defined not only the work enslaved Africans could do, but also their status in society. These laws provided structure to a system that limited mobility, rights, and recognition. Such practices were justified through social beliefs of the time, reinforcing the idea that different groups occupied different positions within society. These early legal decisions formed the basis of systems that would shape the nation for generations. Over time, the effects of these laws influenced political power, economic development, and cultural identity. The story of these beginnings is not just about the creation of laws, but about the formation of a worldview, a way of understanding who belonged, who held authority, and whose voices were heard. As we continue to explore this history, it is important to reflect on how these early choices still influence modern society. If you find this topic valuable and would like to follow along as we uncover more chapters of this story, please remember to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to the channel for more historical explorations. As the colonies grew and developed, their economies and daily lives became increasingly tied to the labor of people brought from distant shores. Ships crossed the Atlantic carrying individuals who had been taken from their homelands, separated from their communities, and forced into unfamiliar surroundings. Once they arrived, the world they encountered was governed by rules designed not only to direct their labor, but to define their place in society. These rules became known as slave codes, and they would shape the lives of countless individuals for generations. The slave codes were not simply guidelines for work. They were written into law, crafted to establish clear boundaries around behavior, movement, and identity. Through these laws, authorities sought to maintain order in a growing society that relied heavily on controlled labor. One of the most significant aspects of these codes was the restriction on travel. Individuals were not permitted to move freely from one place to another without permission from the person who held authority over them. Whether the distance was great or small, movement required written authorization, and traveling without it could result in punishment. This control over movement prevented the formation of independent communities and limited contact with family members who might have been taken to different regions. Another feature of the slave codes dealt with learning. The ability to read and write was seen as a form of power, knowledge that could inspire communication, cooperation, or even plans for escape. As a result, several regions passed laws that made it illegal to teach people of African descent to read or write. Schools that attempted to offer such lessons were discouraged or punished, and individuals found with books or writing materials could face consequences. By restricting education, authorities sought to maintain a system in which knowledge remained concentrated among those already in positions of influence. Property rights were also shaped by these laws. Individuals who labored under these conditions were not permitted to own land or possessions in the same way that others could. Even the smallest personal items could be taken or reallocated at any time. This limitation prevented the accumulation of resources that could lead to independence. In a society where property was deeply connected to status and security, this restriction reinforced social divisions and limited the possibility of economic advancement. Personal freedom, perhaps the most fundamental of all human experiences, was also tightly controlled. Decisions about the most basic aspects of life, where to live, when to work, how to spend time, were not made by those who performed the labor, but by others. Days were structured according to schedules designed to maximize productivity and minimize opportunities for resistance. The laws were written to ensure that this structure remained in place, leaving little room for personal expression or autonomy. Yet within these limitations, individuals found ways to preserve identity, culture, and community. Stories, songs, and traditions were passed quietly among families and neighbors. Spiritual practices continued in forms adapted to new environments. Communication occurred in moments of rest, shared work, or whispered conversation. Even when formal rights were denied, a sense of self and heritage endured. The slave codes reveal more than legal restrictions, they show how a society attempted to use law to shape identity. By defining who could learn, who could move, who could own, and who could decide, these laws reflected the values and priorities of the time. Understanding these codes offers insight into how systems of inequality became embedded in the structure of the early nation. It also highlights the resilience of those who lived under these conditions, who found ways to maintain dignity, connection, and humanity in the face of restriction. In the years following the American Revolution, leaders from different regions gathered to determine how the new nation would be governed. The colonies had declared independence together, but they did not always agree on how power should be distributed. Each region had its own economy, priorities, and social structure. As representatives met to draft the Constitution, debates emerged about how political representation should be determined in this new country. One of the most contentious questions centered on population and who counted within it. Southern states relied heavily on labor performed by people of African descent, and these states had large populations of individuals living in forced servitude. The leaders of these states wanted these individuals counted in full when determining the number of representatives each state would receive in Congress. More counted individuals meant more political influence at the national level. However, these same leaders did not consider those individuals to have legal rights or personal freedom. They did not view them as members of society with voices or agency. Instead, they saw the count as a means of increasing their own power. Delegates from northern states objected. Many of them lived in regions where such labor systems were less central to the economy. They argued that if individuals were not granted the rights of citizens, they should not be counted equally in determining representation. The debate grew intense, reflecting not only political strategy but differing worldviews about humanity, labor, and the structure of society. The resolution that emerged became known as the 3/5 Compromise. Under this agreement, each individual living under forced labor would be counted as 3/5 of a person for the purposes of determining a state's population. This calculation would affect how many seats each state received in the House of Representatives and how taxes were assessed. In essence, the compromise acknowledged the presence of these individuals but assigned them a reduced status within the political system. This agreement did not change the daily lives of those affected. It did not grant rights, freedom, or recognition. Instead, it turned human lives into numbers calculated for political advantage. The compromise revealed a tension at the heart of the new nation. Ideals of liberty and equality existed alongside systems that denied those very principles to many people living within its borders. The 3/5 Compromise served as a reminder of how power can be shaped through definitions and measurements. By assigning a numerical value to human presence while withholding rights, lawmakers created a system in which representation was expanded without acknowledging the humanity of those who contributed to the nation's growth through labor. Their work supported economies, families, and industries, yet their voices were not included in decisions that guided the future of the country. Over time, this compromise would influence political dynamics, affecting elections, policy decisions, and regional alliances. It played a role in shaping the balance of power between different parts of the nation and contributed to tensions that would eventually escalate into conflict. The compromise was not simply a mathematical formula, it was an expression of how society viewed identity and belonging. Understanding this moment in history provides insight into the complexities of the nation's early development. It shows how documents and agreements can reflect both the aspirations and contradictions of a society. It also invites reflection on how systems of representation continue to influence the lives of individuals today. In the early decades of the 19th century, the United States was expanding rapidly. The idea of a growing nation, stretching from the Atlantic coast toward distant frontiers, captured the imagination of many settlers and leaders. They envisioned farms, towns, and new economic opportunities. Yet, the lands they looked toward were not empty. These regions were home to established Native American nations with their own cultures, governance systems, and histories stretching back centuries. For generations, many Native communities had maintained diplomatic relationships, negotiated treaties, and found ways to coexist alongside the growing United States. However, as the number of settlers increased, pressure on land intensified. Debates emerged in Congress and within local governments about how to address the presence of Native nations in these areas. Some voices called for continued negotiation and coexistence, while others argued that expansion could only be achieved by removing Native peoples from their homelands. In 1830, these debates culminated in the passage of an influential piece of legislation. It authorized the government to negotiate the relocation of Native American nations to lands west of the Mississippi River in exchange for their ancestral territories in the Southeast and other regions. Supporters of the policy claimed it would reduce conflict and provide both sides with clear boundaries. They presented it as a solution that would allow the nation to grow while offering new territory for Native communities. However, the reality that followed did not reflect the language of mutual agreement. Even though the act stated that relocation should be voluntary, many Native nations faced tremendous pressure. Some leaders were persuaded under circumstances where alternatives were limited, while others resisted and sought to defend their lands through diplomatic appeals. Courts were petitioned, speeches were delivered, and written pleas were sent to government officials. One nation even won a case before the Supreme Court affirming their sovereignty. Yet the ruling was not enforced, and policies continued on their original course. For many families, the negotiations and decisions affected daily life in profound ways. Homes, fields, burial grounds, and sacred spaces were tied not only to physical survival but to identity and memory. Leaving these places meant more than changing landscape, it meant losing the roots that held communities together. The pathways westward were long and challenging. Groups traveled through unfamiliar terrain, experiencing hardship along the way. Oral histories passed down within Native families recall the emotional weight of the journeys, the resilience of those who walked, and the determination to preserve traditions even in new surroundings. The relocation changed the cultural and physical map of the nation. Regions that had once been home to thriving indigenous communities saw new settlements and development. Meanwhile, Native nations rebuilt their communities in new lands, adapting to different environments while continuing to honor their heritage. The policy and the events that followed left lasting effects on identity, belonging, and the relationship between the United States and indigenous peoples. Reflecting on this history provides a deeper understanding of how land, culture, and sovereignty have been intertwined in the shaping of the country. It also highlights the importance of memory, how stories, songs, and shared experiences have preserved connections to places and ancestors, even in times of profound change. After the Civil War ended, the United States entered a period of reflection and rebuilding. The conflict had shaken the nation to its core, and the question of how society would move forward loomed large. Many believed that this moment would mark the beginning of a new era, one in which individuals who had been denied personal freedom would finally be able to participate fully in the life of the nation. However, the pathway toward such change was not straightforward. In many regions, particularly in the South, local leaders sought to restore familiar systems of control, even as the national government attempted to define new standards of citizenship. Almost immediately after the war, some states introduced a series of local regulations known as Black Codes. These laws were written in a way that appeared orderly and administrative, but their effects shaped daily life in profound ways. They established rules about where individuals could work, how they could travel, the types of jobs they were allowed to hold, and what was required to move from one town to another. While these regulations varied from place to place, they shared a common purpose: to limit independence and to ensure that labor systems remained similar to those that had existed before the war. In many areas, individuals were required to sign yearly labor contracts. If a person left their job before the contract expired, they could be penalized or forced to return. These rules restricted mobility and economic choice, making it difficult for families to build new lives on their own terms. At the same time, local authorities often held the power to determine whether someone was employed in an acceptable manner. If not, they could be assigned work through local courts. The lines between legal structure and labor control blurred, shaping a system in which freedom was present in name but limited in practice. As national laws began to expand citizenship and voting rights to formerly excluded individuals, new strategies emerged to restrict participation. Some communities introduced requirements such as literacy tests or property qualifications. These measures were framed as neutral, but they were applied in ways that made it challenging for many to participate. Poll taxes required payment before voting, creating an additional barrier. The process of registering to vote could involve long waits, complex paperwork, or sudden rule changes announced without notice. By the late 19th century, another set of laws came into place, commonly known as Jim Crow laws. These laws established separation in public spaces, schools, transportation, theaters, and restaurants. Signs and regulations defined where people could sit, learn, or gather. The stated purpose was to maintain order, yet the structure created daily reminders of difference and division. This separation influenced education, employment, and community life. Neighborhoods grew apart socially and economically, with long-term effects that continued for generations. Despite these obstacles, families, churches, schools, and local organizations worked to build strong community networks. Educators established learning institutions where literature, history, art, and music flourished. Businesses were created, newspapers were printed, and cultural traditions evolved. Music, language, and shared memory became sources of connection and resilience. These efforts demonstrated a determined commitment to identity and progress, even in environments shaped by unequal opportunity. The period following the Civil War shows how laws can be used not only to govern daily behavior but also to shape social relationships and expectations. By examining the development of black codes and Jim Crow laws, it becomes clear that change in law does not always lead to immediate change in daily life. Yet the response to these challenges also reveals a long history of community building, adaptation, and perseverance that helped lay the foundation for later movements toward greater equality and recognition. As the 19th century drew to a close, the United States was undergoing a period of rapid growth and transformation. Cities expanded, railroads linked distant regions, and new ideas circulated through newspapers and public debate. Yet beneath this atmosphere of progress, deep questions remained unresolved about how people of different backgrounds would live alongside one another. Local customs and state laws had already created divisions in schools, transportation, and public spaces, but these practices had not yet been formally tested by the highest institutions of the government. In 1896, a court case arose that would shape these questions for decades to come. The case centered on a man who challenged a state law requiring separate railway accommodations. He boarded a passenger car designated for white travelers and was asked to move. When he refused, he was arrested. Supporters of his case argued that the law violated constitutional guarantees of equal protection, claiming that requiring individuals to use separate facilities based on racial categories created inequality by definition. They believed the Constitution promised equal treatment and that this principle should apply to all areas of public life. The legal debate reached the Supreme Court, where justices examined the language of the Constitution and the traditions of the time. They considered whether separation, if applied consistently, could be seen as fair in the eyes of the law. The majority opinion concluded that separation did not necessarily imply inferiority. The ruling stated that if the facilities provided were equivalent in quality, then requiring different groups to use different spaces did not violate constitutional protections. This reasoning became known as the doctrine of separate but equal. Although the ruling appeared to be based on a neutral principle, its effects were far-reaching. Once the decision was announced, many states saw it as confirmation that separation in daily life was acceptable under the law. Transportation, education, housing, and public gathering places became more distinctly divided. Over time, the differences between the facilities offered to each group grew more pronounced. Schools serving different communities often received different levels of funding, equipment, and resources. Public services varied in quality, and opportunities for advancement were shaped by these disparities. The ruling did more than affect physical spaces. It also influenced how people understood their place within society. By presenting separation as lawful, the decision reinforced social boundaries and shaped expectations about interaction. The ruling became a reference point in debates, political speeches, and legal arguments for decades. Efforts to challenge separation faced not only local resistance but also the weight of the highest court's authority. Yet even in the face of these changes, communities continued to organize, educate, and advocate. Teachers worked to build schools filled with knowledge and creativity, families encouraged the pursuit of learning, and local organizations formed networks of support. Cultural expression through music, art, and storytelling flourished, preserving memory and shaping identity. The ruling may have shaped public spaces, but it did not silence voices or diminish the desire for recognition and fairness. As time passed, new generations emerged, influenced by the past yet determined to shape a different future. They studied legal history, observed the consequences of separation, and began to question whether the promise of equal had truly been fulfilled. Discussions grew into movements into challenges, and challenges into new examinations of the law itself. The ruling from 1896 stands as a reminder of how a single court decision can influence daily life, public policy, and the national conversation. It reveals how interpretations of equality can vary and how societies must continually examine the meaning of fairness in practice as well as in principle. As the 20th century began, cities across the United States expanded rapidly. New neighborhoods appeared alongside factories, streetcar lines, and growing business districts. Homeownership became a symbol of stability and progress, representing a place to build a future and pass down security to the next generation. Many families dreamed of owning a house with a yard, a street with familiar neighbors, and a sense of belonging. Yet the pathways to achieving this dream were not open to everyone in the same way. Banks, real estate companies, and government agencies played key roles in deciding who could buy homes and where they could live. In the 1930s, during a time of economic hardship, federal programs were created to help stabilize the housing market. One part of this effort involved mapping neighborhoods to guide lending decisions. On these maps, certain areas were marked as reliable and financially promising, while others were labeled as risky. The criteria used to make these judgments went beyond building conditions or local income levels. Communities were often evaluated based on who lived there, particularly their racial background. Neighborhoods where black families lived, even those with strong community ties and well-kept homes, were frequently outlined in red ink. This designation signaled to banks and lenders that loans in these areas were undesirable. The term redlining came to describe this practice. Families in these marked neighborhoods found it difficult or impossible to secure home loans with fair terms, even if they had stable jobs and savings. Meanwhile, neighborhoods marked in more favorable colors received support, investment, and opportunities to grow. This system shaped the development of entire cities. In areas that received loans and funding, new houses were built, schools were improved, and public services expanded. Families living there could build equity over time as property values rose. This equity could be used to start businesses, support education, or assist the next generation in purchasing homes of their own. In contrast, areas affected by redlining faced limited investment. Buildings aged without repair, public services struggled to keep pace with needs, and opportunities for upward mobility became harder to achieve. Real estate practices reinforced these patterns. Some communities adopted agreements that restricted who could buy or occupy homes in certain areas. These agreements were included in property deeds and contracts, shaping neighborhood boundaries and limiting where families could live, even if they had the resources to move. Social norms and local policies further encouraged separation, influencing where schools, hospitals, parks, and businesses were located. Despite these barriers, families developed strong networks of support within their communities. Churches, local organizations, and cultural gatherings created spaces for shared identity and mutual assistance. People invested in one another through mentorship, storytelling, and community leadership. Neighborhoods thrived on creativity, music, and a strong sense of resilience. Yet the financial challenges remained. Without access to the same opportunities for homeownership and investment, it became harder to accumulate resources across generations. Over time, the effects of these housing policies extended far beyond the neighborhoods where they first appeared. They influenced patterns of wealth, education, health, and employment, shaping the landscape of cities and the experiences of different communities. The legacy of these policies can still be seen in the divisions between neighborhoods today, some flourishing with abundant resources, others facing ongoing challenges. Understanding this history reveals how financial systems and urban planning can shape the opportunities available to individuals and families. It also shows how ideas about place and identity can become woven into the structure of daily life. The story of redlining is not only about housing, but about the relationship between community, opportunity, and the ability to build a foundation for the future. As the decades passed, many of the laws that once shaped daily life were rewritten or removed. Court decisions overturned old rulings, federal legislation declared new standards, and public voices challenged systems that had stood for generations. On paper, the nation began to reflect its promises more clearly: equal protection, equal opportunity, and the idea that every individual should have the chance to pursue a fulfilling future. Yet changing the wording of laws did not immediately change the structures built under them. Neighborhoods shaped by earlier housing policies continued to carry the financial effects of limited investment. Property values and school funding were often tied together, meaning that a history of restricted access to homeownership translated into fewer educational resources for many communities. These gaps influenced classroom experiences, shaping the opportunities available to young students and the pathways open to them as they grew older. Employment opportunities followed similar patterns. Areas that had struggled to attract investment found it difficult to support new businesses, job training programs, or stable industries. Families faced challenges passing down resources to future generations. The idea of building long-term financial stability remained more available to some than to others. Meanwhile, the legal system also reflected the legacy of earlier structures. Rules and practices developed over time influenced how laws were enforced, who faced greater scrutiny, and which communities were more likely to experience heavier policing. As the criminal justice system expanded in the 20th century, these patterns intensified. The number of individuals facing extended sentences grew, and entire families and neighborhoods felt the impact. The effects were not isolated to those involved directly, but extended to employment prospects, education, and the overall well-being of communities. Even within public conversations, echoes of old divisions could still be heard. Assumptions shaped by history influenced how people understood one another, how neighborhoods interacted, and how opportunities were distributed. Yet alongside these challenges, movements continued to grow. Scholars researched and taught this history, communities documented their stories, and individuals worked to build connections across experiences. Conversations about fairness, representation, and shared responsibility gained momentum in classrooms, homes, and public spaces. The story of these changes is not solely one of hardship. It is also a story of resilience, creativity, and determination. Families built traditions that carried meaning. Leaders emerged from local communities to speak, write, organize, and guide. Artists, musicians, and storytellers created works that preserved memory and inspired new generations. The effort to build a more inclusive and equitable society has continued through countless acts of learning, teaching, and listening. Understanding the past allows us to recognize the ways it continues to shape the present. It invites reflection on how systems are formed and how they can be reshaped. And it reminds us that change is ongoing, shaped by the choices and voices of those who continue to engage with this history. If you would like to join us as we explore more stories from the past and reflect on their meaning today, please remember to like this video and subscribe to the channel.